Okay, well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for our final session in our Spotlight on Financial Services series, where industry experts have been discussing latest issues facing the financial services sector. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land I'm presenting from today. I recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to all First Nations people joining us. My name's Anne McNamara. I'm a partner here in the Banking and Financial Services team at Hall & Wilcox, and I'm based in Sydney. And today I'm joined by an illustrious panel. Amy Ward at the far end from Commonwealth Super Corporation, Tim Jenkins from Mercer, Senior Consultant and Actuary, and Sarah Abood from the Financial Planning Association of Australia. I think I've got that wrong, Sarah. I'm sorry.
We have just changed our name.
Yes, so that's just changed its name, FPA. So I just wanted to set a little bit of context, first of all, before we start. Around 16 million Australians have super. We hold close to $3.3 trillion in superannuation assets, or about nearly 150% of GDP. For individuals, super is usually their second highest asset. I think for some of the younger people in the room, probably their biggest asset. Research referred to in the Quality of Advice report found that managing super issues was in the top 3 financial matters for people aged 50 and over. And among those with unmet advice needs, nearly 30% wanted help with making their money last for a lifetime, and 25% wanted help with retirement planning. So the burning question that's going to affect all of us, 16 million of us, at some point in time, is how to know what to do with our super when we retire. And really the question that we're exploring today is, what role should super funds play? Just a little bit of housekeeping. We've got about 120 people online. If any of our online attendees have any questions they would like to ask, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll be addressing questions throughout the event. If I don't get to yours, please feel free to contact us afterwards. If you have a comment, you can pop it in the chat box. Please note the chat box is not anonymous. Today's session is being recorded and people will receive a copy of the recording. I'm not sure how long that recording will be available for. Okay, now I think I might get on the level here with our panel. And I thought it might be easiest to ask Amy, Tim and Sarah to introduce themselves to you and to explain to you why they're passionate about the topic that we're talking about quickly. So Sarah, we'll
5 words or less. Thanks, Anne. So my name's Sarah Abood. I'm CEO of the Financial Advice Association of Australia. We have just changed our name because recently we merged with the Association of Financial Advisors, the AFA and the FPA, have become the FAAA. So our role is a professional association. We represent financial advisors and planners around Australia, and we're a professional association, so that means we also act in the public interest. The QAR and the issues of ensuring that Australians have access to high quality and affordable advice is very important to us. It's very top of mind for our members. This is probably one of the biggest consultations that we've been involved in, and we're very much involved in the consultation process from now on and just making sure that we're able to get the right outcomes for members and consumers.
Okay, Tim.
Tim Jenkins. I'm a partner at Mercer Consulting. So I lead the Mercer superannuation and actuarial consulting team. So yes, I have the personality of an actuary. I'm also heavily involved with the Actuaries Institute, and I'm the chair of the Institute's Superannuation and Investment Practice Committee. And it's in the actuarial role that I've become quite involved with advice to look at the issues that people have as they approach and enter retirement. It's so hard, and I'm sure we'll be unpacking this, Anne. So that's why I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you. Amy.
My name's Amy Ward and I work for the Commonwealth Superannuation Corporation, which is a mouthful, but it's CSC. CSC has over 750,000 members. I'm passionate about super because I've been working in it for a number of years. I've worked for both boutique, mid-tier size firms and law firms as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Okie dokie. Now, just again, a bit more context. Some super funds offer personal advice or access to personal advice, but some provide only factual information or general advice and then direct their members to get their advice elsewhere. The topics that can be addressed as intra-fund advice in a super fund are also quite limited. So if a super fund has salaried advisors, then the topics are limited. We also know that super fund trustees have obligations to act in their members' best financial interests and a specific duty to assist members with their retirement needs. And then, Sarah, in your space, there are fewer financial advisors. So we know from the Levy report that at a peak of 28,000, Michelle now says there are 16,000, or quoted advice, there were 16,000 financial planners registered in Australia. So that's one advisor per 1,000 superannuation members, which is clearly a problem. I'm going to start with Amy because I think we know what your position will be on this, Sarah, but does our retirement income system make it important that people get advice? Does it matter whether they're getting advice at the beginning of their career or at the end of their career? And what do you think about that, Amy?
So if I look at your question, it's about whether the system supports advice. And I think to some extent it's trying to. At the moment, we've been looking at law changes in the last few years that concentrate on giving advice, particularly where we've seen ASIC has talked about giving advice in the context of super. We've seen changes through the SIS Act as well to deal with charging. I guess the question is, do we need to do more or is there more to be done? I think advice is quite inaccessible for some people because of cost, and there's issues around how we charge advice. So I think when we're saying, does the system support it? I think it supports it to some extent, and super funds need to think of innovative ways to nudge members to seek the advice in the first place. You have to know that the advice is there to be sought, and then it becomes an issue about how the fund manages that.
So we've got a system of nudges and defaults, Tim, so already implemented. So we've seen that with FOFA and and other initiatives that have been taken. So do you think nudges and other default systems might work for retirement income?
Right. I'm actually not going to answer that to start with. I'm going to actually go a little way to start with. No, I just wanted to put on the record here that you talked about 16,000 financial advisors.
Yeah.
I'm on that register.
Yeah.
Because I advise employers.
Right.
So there's a whole group of people
yeah.
on the ASIC advice register who are there because they're stockbrokers,
Yeah.
or because they're actuaries advising employers.
Right.
So actually the number of people there to give personal financial advice is actually a fair bit less than 16,000. Right. So it's one per 1,200 maybe.
Okay. Okay. Well,
so
you.
Just a quick one for you on that. Maybe we can unpack that. But on nudges, when you start to think about the number of people who stay in accumulation sections of superannuation funds, when even just for tax reasons, it would be beneficial for them to be retirement phase, that's telling you there's a problem. And that's around the fact that if you move to retirement phase, you're actually acquiring a new product in the way things are constructed. Maybe in the member's mind it isn't, but that's the construct. I move from an accumulation product, a MySuper or Choice, to a retirement product. And that means you cannot do certain things under the Corps Act. You can't hawk. So when we did the analysis of the number of members, say over age 60, 65, still in the accumulation phase with no contributions heading into their account, it was telling me that there's some low-hanging fruit which can be addressed if you make it easier for people to move from where they are. Nudges are a really good example, and also ways, if you construct it appropriately, to make it easy for people to do things. There are so many things to determine at that point that if you make it easy, if you tick the box here, we will do this for you, but you have the right to do other things and you should get advice. But just to help them that first stage when there's so much happening, I think is really important. And a few of the superannuation funds have started to move down that route, and some have that in place.
And what about a default? Does it have to be a nudge and a decision, or could
Well,
it be a default?
Okay, so it could be, but I think you might find problems there looking at the members' best financial interests from the, so that's not from the superannuation perspective, but from the perspective of the individual, because I'm not looking holistically, I'm looking at the one person.
Yeah,
There's so much you do not know about that individual
Yeah.
that you could accidentally put them somewhere on the default that actually isn't the right path.
yes,
So I think that's a problem.
yes,
It is very hard. It would be nice, but I think everyone has shied away from that
yes,
because of those issues.
yeah.
And also because pension products are considered a separate financial product as opposed to an accumulation product.
Yeah. And Sarah, do you?
In terms of advice being important, I don't think it would come as any surprise to anybody that I would say an absolute yes to that. I think it is in large part because we've created such a complex system. It's become almost impossible to navigate on your own. You know, if you actually have a life, you don't want to spend your weekends reading the SIS Act and the Income Tax Assessment Act, then you're probably going to want some help with that. The challenges that have been talked about are very real. And one example of that complexity is, who can I get advice from? And the way that the laws are constructed right now, of course, is that you need to be a relevant provider if you're going to give advice to a consumer about a retail financial product. That's the way that the legislation is constructed. And as Tim has so eloquently pointed out, there are a lot fewer advisors than there used to be. And that is in part because the regulation has really, really snowballed in the last couple of years. So financial advice has become a profession. There are a range of requirements around the education, the ethical standards, the experience that you need to have in order to practice as a financial advisor. So the numbers are a problem, and that is one of the reasons, it's not the only one, but it's one of the reasons why proper financial advice, if you like, as an engagement with a relevant provider, a qualified financial advisor, has become very expensive. You would struggle to get a piece of comprehensive advice for less than $3,500 right now. Many charge much more, and that is certainly in excess of the expectations that the average consumer has in terms of what advice ought to cost them. And we've started talking about the challenges that superannuation funds have, and many, there are many different strategies in the super fund world. Many of them do refer members to our members if there is a need for that more comprehensive advice. But to trying to kind of wind your way through the complexity of the regulations, starting from a position of, wouldn't it be great if we could help our members more? Wouldn't it be great if we could help them maximise their retirement? The barriers to doing that and the complexity of executing that well has become quite high risk from a regulatory perspective. And I think many of us have seen some of the proposals from the QAR as an opportunity to clarify some of those obligations and to give trustees a clearer path, but also financial advisors and other product issuers to make that a little bit easier. So that reducing of complexity will help.
Okay, so I therefore would like to talk about the retirement income covenant. So notwithstanding that it's complex and tricky, we've had an obligation on the books now for trustees to assist members meet various risks that they will encounter in retirement. And so Tim, I know Mercer's done some research on this. So I don't know whether you want to talk about, how well trustees are embracing that obligation or dealing with it.
Sure. Yeah, and it was all put in place with a very short runway
Yes.
between the Act and the explanatory materials where most of the detail is and how the expectation is you comply.
Yeah.
And implementation date of 1 July. So
Yeah.
it was like 3-month runway.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we work with about 20 trustees to help them on different components. And one thing we found was that most trustees, as you would expect, have already been assisting in these areas. It's a very rare fund that doesn't have an account-based pension or a transition to retirement pension. Less have more complex products on their suite, a lifetime income products, for example, or some of the nudges and soft defaults that we referred to before. So what was interesting as we started to unpack this, and we still haven't seen the analysis by APRA and ASIC, which was happening of what they thought of the formulation strategies behind the scenes. You don't get to see those. All you get to see is the website summary of what's there. And the summaries were constructed two very different ways. It was quite interesting. There was one lot which said, I have to do a strategy. I have to make all these determinations. I have to say, what do I mean by approaching retirement? What do I mean by retirement income? What do I mean by maximizing retirement income? What do I mean by the length of the retirement period? There's lots of decisions you had to make, and there were different decisions you could choose to make with limited guidance and the information you might have, internal and external data. So a lot of effort on those, and the strategies half the funds put out there were saying, this is the strategy I've put in place so I can help my members. Whereas the other half turned it around and it was more like a marketing document. And this was, these are the things we have you can use based on our strategy to help you. And they're very different things in terms of the content. Perhaps that is because of the way the Act was framed, as opposed to that. So we had all that going through, and there was a number of funds said what we're going to investigate. It was quite interesting seeing where the trends might be. And maybe that's something we'll come to a bit later on.
So Sarah, given that we've got this retirement income covenant, and Michelle Levy is recommending in her report that super funds should be able to give simple, good advice to its members, how do you see that playing out? I mean, it seems impossible for a super fund to meet its obligations to under the retirement income covenant without providing some kind of advice. So how?
So, yeah, and that's the big question, I guess. And we're certainly engaging with a range of super funds and with associations and so on. Certainly the first challenge that we have with that proposition is the transition to retirement is generally not simple. So for members, there are certainly some members who perhaps don't have a very large balance, who might be single, where the complexities are minimal. But even for clients in that position, there is some complexity that's hard to ignore. So we spoke about the type of information that a fund has on its members. If we don't have information about their partner and their partner's super, if they have one, don't have information about their estate planning needs and requirements, we can't talk to them about Centrelink, can't talk to them about other matters that are very relevant to their retirement. It does make it very difficult to do well outside of the relevant provider framework. And the proposals that Michelle has made potentially enable funds to do more, but those risks still remain. And the other area of needing to review is the sole purpose test, of course, because we would certainly suggest that it is very hard to give that advice in a framework where the sole purpose test is still being adhered to. So super funds have many ways of dealing with that. I mentioned some refer to our members, some employ financial advisors themselves, some use intra-fund advice. There are a range of different strategies that funds are using right now. But I think there's still a level of uncertainty about how that could change over time and whether, for example, a fund could provide some of that advice perhaps digitally, or perhaps within the current requirements and the current frameworks.
Okay.
Those matters are very much topics
Yeah.
of discussion at the moment.
I wouldn't mind just unpacking some of what you've talked about, and maybe, Amy, I'll ask you the sole purpose test, just for people who may not, you know, in 25 words or less. Do you want to talk about what the issue might be in this space? Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, in the context of advice.
In the context of what Sarah's just said.
Yes. So I'll rephrase the legislation, but essentially it is that you provide benefits to members, and then it talks about ancillary benefits like insurance, but for this purpose of retirement. And so when we're looking at advice, and we provide advice either through our super fund or through independent firms, the issue is when you're charging, are you actually meeting the sole purpose test? Because it doesn't deal with advice. When the legislation was drafted, it only talks about 3 purposes. So the issue comes back down to whether advice can be charged in that.
Paid
Yes,
for.
yes,
Value
that's
paid for.
right. Yes.
Okay, so we might swing back to that in a little while. You mentioned digital and calculate. I wouldn't mind talking about calculators. I think, again, some Mercer research is that I think 2/3 of super funds have got calculators on their website, and super funds clearly use calculators as part of their retirement income strategy, either to provide factual information or availing themselves of the ASIC relief that's available. They provide some level of personal advice. The ASIC relief, Michelle Levy noted, is not easy to comply with. You have to, there are standardized default assumptions. You can't recommend your own product. And it's still necessary to meet all the other requirements like complying with the best interest duty. So there are a few fishhooks in actually utilising that. Leaving Levy sort of on the bookshelf at the moment, clearly there's an intent nevertheless by the regulator, and presumably a policy decision, that super funds ought to be able to provide advice using the relief that's available. What do you think the role of calculators should be?
So, pardon me, in terms of digital advice in general, it's critically important. I think consumers expect to receive information in that format. So I think if a fund didn't have a digital strategy in some way for its members, it would be very challenging. The issue is how far they can go, and what information do they require in order to do a good job. So, as I understand it, the current law is that it's technology indifferent, in the sense that if you want to provide retail advice to a consumer, you can do that via a computer program if you want to, but it must meet the same standards as a relevant provider would. And there are particular challenges that super funds have doing that right now, as we've spoken about. The other aspect to consider, because we've spoken a bit about what is the type of advice that might be given, we're getting into now who is giving that advice. And that is another piece that the Quality of Advice Review considers and proposes, that perhaps there might be some areas of advice that you would not require a relevant provider for. And I think all the issues we've touched on earlier are the reasons why it is a concerning proposition that in order to give advice, even that's good, even that meets that lower standard, it's very hard to do that without having the experience, the education, the qualifications that currently financial advisors do. And it is that transition to retirement piece where we'd see the risk as being largest, because if you get that wrong, it's very hard to undo for a consumer later on. And from a trustee perspective, many are concerned, I think, seeing that as a high risk area. So whether digital tools will be more invested in, I think we don't know. I think that many of the funds will look for more certainty on a lot of these areas before they pour a great deal into those tools. There are some tools out there that do meet the current requirements, for example, of being a relevant provider, but there aren't a lot. So the idea that you need to digitally engage with your members, that's critical, but you need to be able to find a way to help them more when they need more help. And that's where the debate is right now. Certainly our view would be that it is quite difficult to do that as a transition to retirement without something or someone that looks a lot like a financial advisor.
Okay, so I know that some calculators try and deal with some of the complexity by treating members in cohorts. So they try and sort of say, okay, let's make all these assumptions and have a category of members that has, a consistent range of features, and we'll deal with this calculator, by classifying people into teams, So I don't know whether you have any.
Yeah, look, I'm not a superannuation lawyer specialist. I think, the tricky area we get into there is the difference between my duty as a trustee to act in the collective interests of my members, but also in the individual interests of individual members.
Yeah.
And the danger of that approach is that you start to get scenarios where they might clash, and the interests of the individual might not be consistent with the interests of the collective. I don't have an answer for you, Anne. It is a tricky problem.
Yeah.
Our members have a duty to their client. They don't have that collective obligation. So that's not one that we need to deal with.
Amy, have you got anything that you want to chime in about cohorts there?
Yeah, look, I think calculators, as Tim said, can be a good nudge towards an action. The issue is around the call to action arising from a calculator. In terms of the current framework, there are limitations because you can't recommend a product, but you actually have to have the member input the data. So it really relies on the member to understand what they need in order to put that input into the calculator.
And presumably being able to understand
the graphs,
yeah.
yes, and what's being spat out. So as Tim said, one of the issues really is there's behavioural design, defaulting, getting people to change behaviour, but how do we do that when we've got limited number of advisors? How do we do that when we've got a framework that deals with, a product being a separate financial product? If you're going to move from accumulation to pension, you're not necessarily going to see that in a calculator. You're just going to see a projection. Potentially, it may or may not tell you what you need to do because you can't recommend a product. So it's very hard, and again, it's very much reliant on the member to understand that superannuation, there are two products. When you get to retirement, you have to make a choice. Super funds have this data. It's how do we push that behaviour using behavioural design?
Are we financially literate enough anyway? I guess I don't know. Right? So I'm going
That's a big question, Anne, on that one. Just on the calculators, did mention before that I'm involved with the Actuaries Institute, and actuaries love projections. You can imagine that. It's lots of numbers. We have a standard out there to help actuaries who are asked to help with the calculators and projections. 499.02 if you want to go on the website and have a look. It's 30 pages long. That is how complex it is, even for people who are numerate, to think about this because of
especially
the Act, relief, exactly right.
Yeah.
And we had 5 hours discussion about, do you use average weekly earnings or CPI for deflators and things? You can imagine how much fun we had. But a real point for everyone here is, if it's hard for the experts, just imagine when you start to use the tools, if you don't understand what's behind them, the wrong things that can happen. So I just wanted to put that, it's very difficult. And if I'm a superannuation fund, I would love to do these things. It helps me engage. It helps me bring the cost down potentially for my people. But I'm wary in the current environment. To Sarah's point, how do I know I'm complying? And then if you go beyond that, what if the rules change? Do I have to do everything again? You can't use the tools from overseas very well in Australia. And that's hard.
Yeah, okay. So Sarah, has the FPA got a FAA?
FAA, it's cool. It'll take a while.
I mean, you said you see calculators as part of the solution, but have you got a position on this? Yeah.
So, from our perspective, who's giving this advice, whether it's a tool or a call center operative, the important thing is that it be able to do that well, that it have the information about the consumer, that whatever calculations or projections it does are well based, but also importantly that the consumer or the member understands what they're getting. And traditionally that role has been played very well by financial advisors, because if someone will get a great output from a calculator, then so what do I do with it? What's next? And as Amy's pointed out, it's actually very hard for super funds to do that. Where we see potential is that if we are narrowing the scope of advice, and if super funds are potentially looking at bringing in people who are not relevant providers to provide pieces of advice to their members, then that is almost giving us a glide path to creating a world where we have a lot more fully qualified financial advisors. We've done a lot of work in the last couple of years on what are the qualifications, what are the ethical standards, what are the values that you need to have to give advice to consumers, and that exists. So what we would like to see is those people being enrolled in a course of study that will ultimately lead them to being a financial advisor. And we see that as being very much in the interests of the funds as well, the funds who choose that strategy, because they're creating a pool of people that have had experience engaging with consumers, have the right education and qualifications to do that, and over time are moving to a position where they can give that full piece of advice. So that, I think that's the opportunity. That idea of a digital tool being mediated and explained to a consumer by someone who has got the knowledge to do that, and the empathy and the skills to do that, we think will give the best result and the best outcome.
Okay, and now thinking about how we pay for it, how a fund would pay for it all. So I guess that's really a major question for superannuation funds is, and we've talked about the sole purpose test and the trickiness with that. I know the Levy report has recommended that members ought to be able to pay for advice out of their account and whatever. Any comments on where we're at now and what the right answer is? It's a problem. You want to chime in, Amy?
Yeah, sure. Look,
Busting
well, Tim and I briefly discussed this before, and not all super funds will be able to rely on this. But you know, last year we saw a lot of super funds develop their own, you know, trust or account to raise money for penalties, and that becomes assets outside of the superannuation assets of members. So potentially that becomes up to the trustees' discretion as to how they use those funds in terms of whether they fund advice and look at how much investment they put into advice. But in terms of charging, that still becomes an issue unless, you know, if we take away Section 99F, then it probably becomes less of an issue. But Tim, what do you?
And I'd say that the intra-fund rules at present, as you mentioned, Anne, are quite limiting.
Yes.
They need to be expanded, I think, to help people more broadly.
Yes.
There's some obvious things that people want that you can't necessarily provide under the existing rules.
Yes.
And when you unpack the advice people have, yes, there are some people with very complex issues that need a professional financial advisor.
Yes.
There are others where if you're a financial advisor, you will have seen that situation previously lots of times, but for the individual, it's overwhelming. So some of those things can be a lot more straightforward. It's a bit like there are 10 personas out there, say, and of those 6, here's a package for you, perhaps. It's a different way of thinking about things. So maybe the superannuation funds can move to people like me, doing it obviously within the law, to help people with the nudges and thought process to help them make these very difficult decisions.
I think Michelle Levy in the report, I mean, she certainly referred to the sole purpose test and, you know, took a view expressed her own opinion as to what the sole purpose test meant in the context of intra-fund advice. But I think, Tim, you mentioned, you know, her terms of reference didn't allow her to make any recommendation with respect to the sole purpose test. Is that a problem? Should, you know, what do you think about that?
One of the hardest bits, and I think everyone's talked about this, the information you don't know or you would like to know to give a better advice. If I'm a superannuation fund member and I'm partnered, the likelihood is my partner isn't in the same fund. So it's quite difficult to give advice when you probably need both bits of information to solve the problem. A lot of this is because of the means test for the age pension and the way that works, and social security, aged care, everything interrelates. It gets so difficult on there. The decisions you make here change other things. And because of that, yes, it'd be great to alter the sole purpose test, but I wonder, even if that happened, how effective it could be because of these extra pieces you would need to have. Is that solvable? I don't know.
Okay.
Yes,
So-
because it only
yeah.
solves the charging aspect. It doesn't actually deal with the complexity of whether, you know, somebody, you know, even if they use calculators, it doesn't actually assist them with, for example, co-contribution strategies with spouses having an age difference and optimizing retirement pensions. So that in itself is the problem which sole purpose can't solve.
I wonder then whether we're asking too much of superannuation trustees, you know. So if you, and I'm just looking at her recommendation 6. So it was superannuation fund trustees should be able to provide personal advice to their members about their interests in the fund, including when they are transitioning to retirement. So she makes that. In doing so, trustees will be required to take into account the members' personal circumstances, including their family situation and social security entitlements, if that is relevant to the advice. Superannuation fund trustees should have power to decide how to charge members for personal advice they provide to members, and the restrictions on collecting, charging of fees should be removed. And so that's the recommendation 6. I mean, are we asking too much of super funds in the circumstance?
I'll come in first then.
I don't know anyone to look to. It's pretty hard.
I kind of think you've answered that by the way you asked the question, Anne. It's difficult, isn't it?
I was just
Yeah.
following on
Yeah.
from the difficulties that you were pointing out. And I know, Sarah, that you've said, well, transition to retirement, you're seeing that as a key timing,
Yeah.
and a very complex decision, you know, that's hard to unwind.
I think the critical words there are advise members about their interests in the fund.
Yes.
So
yes.
that is relatively uncontroversial if the member is in accumulation
Yes.
phase, and you're giving some simple advice about, you know, maybe what accumulation option, what investment options should I pick, my superannuation contributions and so on. But the rubber does hit the road when you're transitioning to retirement, because the scope of the advice to be good, I would suggest even to be good, let alone to be in the best interests of the member, has got to consider matters that are outside the scope of the member's interest in the fund. And I think that's where trustees will have difficulty in working out how they discharge that. And it also presents problems, of course, in terms of how that's charged. And can the cost of that advice, which will be greater, be collectively charged?
Yeah.
And it is challenging to see how that could be done.
I know we've got big funds and small funds online, so I'd be really glad to receive comments from anyone in the audience or anyone online in relation to how you're thinking about this. I think it might be good to keep this topic ventilated anyway.
So,
I want to talk about data. So you know, we'll go for a really easy part of the equation now. So if super funds have to address the members' retirement income needs, then they obviously do need all this breadth of information. They'll also need to access presumably other product information. If the advice is to be good advice, say about pension products or performance information or whatever. So how do we do that? What do we do about data?
I mean, that's an issue obviously for all of us to get great data, keep it secure, and make sure it's doing the job it needs to for consumers. But you know, the other, I mean, firstly, there are the technical difficulties in designing a system and having the ability to collect that data, obtaining permission of the relevant people to use it. But then I think the other problem super trustees face is, well, what if I've found out that my member's partner is in another super fund? What if their allocated pension product is cheaper than mine? What do I do? You know, you have a very direct conflict there if you're, you know, funding advice from your fund, and the right answer might be
Change funds.
Yeah,
Yeah.
buy someone else's product. And that's not, you know, that is a real dilemma, I think, that would be faced. So it's not just the technical and logistical issues about collecting that data. It's how can I do a good job, or ideally the best possible job, because I do have an obligation as a trustee to act in the interests of my members. What do I do if that's in their interests? And that's a dilemma that's very hard to solve. And, you know, our whole profession has grown up in order to try and, how do you solve that dilemma in the interests of the consumer?
If I could just
Yeah.
come in with a different angle,
Mm.
because that's absolutely right.
Mm.
But if I am there and I am the superannuation fund, one of the things I'm wanting to do, as well as comply with everything and do the right things for my membership, I'm wanting to grow my fund. It's becoming imperative when you hear messaging, I need to be a certain size to survive. So in that world, the trustees are starting to look at what's my conversion rate from people in accumulation with me to retirement with me. And they're looking at that and saying, some funds are great. You know, there's some funds out there, 95% conversion because of the products and the way they interact and the trust. Whereas others, well, they're even, you know, some are virtually zero on this. So as you look at the conundrum, you have to have the perspective of how can I design the journey of my member and the product suite to make it easy for my member to think that actually I am the right choice, and the advisor's there to say, actually, this is a good call. There are certain things you can do, particularly things like a pension, a bonus if you move within the fund and the capital gains tax you had isn't actually paid. It's capital gains tax exempt on the unrealized capital gains. That can make it easier for the types of decision there for advisors looking at that to say, if that is the case, well, actually, there's a great reason to stay. As I look at the example that you put forward, other things being equal, it's a good reason to stay.
Do you have anything else you want to add?
No, I tend to agree. I think both, you know, all of us have all discussed this concept of behavioural design that lawyers and actuaries can use better to really help members change behaviour. It is really up to us now to really look at that and use the data we have. It's just a matter of doing things differently on how do we do it within the framework we have. And it's not actually easy, right, to change behaviour. But the more defaults you have, I guess, when we talk about defaults, Tim, you love the default soft launch and soft defaults. So I think that's really where you can reduce the complexity of a decision making for members within the framework of the law, of course.
There is one other thing. I have to put this as an actuary.
Yeah.
Do you remember those things called defined benefit pensions?
Indeed, I was.
Didn't that kind of take away many of these decisions?
Yeah.
I had an income for life.
Yeah.
Didn't have to make any call. Just a
Indeed.
thought.
But we
It's 30 years too late.
Do
Yeah.
you think they're coming back?
No, not here,
Horses
not now.
Yeah, yeah. I was going to ask you a question actually, and then I thought, well, perhaps not, because I mean, well, Amy, you're at CSC where there are a number of defined benefit interests, but you've been at other funds as well, worked at other funds as well. I mean, I wonder whether I'm trying to be political about this. I wonder whether our decision makers aren't really in the hot seat enough, perhaps. And yeah, whether because many of them are receiving a defined benefit or are in a fund that provides a benefit that's unlike what the rest of us get.
Look, that's a difficult one for me.
Indeed, it is. Indeed, it is, and I won't ask. Yeah.
But look, I think it. You know, if we work with the framework we have at the moment, I think it is good for lawyers and actuaries and financial planners just to pause and think about how we can do things differently. You know, if this whole concept of making people make decisions differently is very important, and we probably haven't got that focus on the type of skill that is required to make those decisions or make members change those decisions. Tim, you might want to elaborate more on that based on our discussion.
It is quite interesting, Amy. I'm not sure where to go quite, but there are lots of things you can do on there which actually take away the pain or perhaps take away the terror that people have. Just think about what's happened. You can get from SG at age 15 all the way through to the point of retirement, whatever that is. And that's another discussion. Is there such a thing as retirement anymore? Is it a phase? Another story. Without having to make any decision. You can default. You can just let it happen. You can default into a fund or funds. Now with the stapling, maybe only one fund. You can not make any investment decision, no contribution decisions. You can let it happen. It might not be the best thing for you, but you can let that happen. And then all of a sudden, you've got to make a call. And you're not used to it. And I think the nudges and the soft defaults, whatever they are, whatever you may call them, is a way to take away the terror that people might have. All of a sudden, after 30, 40 years, I've got to do something and I'm not sure what to do. And it's in a very complex retirement income system. Super fits in something bigger, and the bigger is even more complex than the super and the super tax.
And Cass Sustain has a book about changing people's behaviour, and a lot of that focus is around behaviours, using the existing system or limits that you have with you, and considering defaults as one of the easier things around, and also just messaging. Did you know other people are doing this? People tend to hurt with those decisions as well.
But one of the hardest things, well, not hardest, one of the things you observe when you have a look at the data. We did this for one of the super funds recently with 20,000 deferred pensioners, account-based pensioners. 1/3 of the membership took the minimum drawdown because that was their cue. They took that as what they should do. But when you actually analyze that, if you do that, the likelihood is you have an unintended bequest. You have too much money at the end, or you're not spending the money when you're well enough to do things on that. So there are things out there, to Amy's point, which influence behavior. And I think the drawdowns for account-based pensions, if they were to be raised, that could actually make one of the biggest differences,
Right.
because people use that as a benchmark. What should I do?
Yeah. Okay. Very interesting. What about the recommendation in the Levy report about personal advice? So if a provider has information about a client, then by virtue of the fact that they hold that information rather than the fact that they've considered the information, that will turn the advice into personal advice. Amy, what do you think? What do you think that means to super funds?
Look, I think every super fund is very different, depending on whether you insource or outsource your contact centre, you provide general advice. If you're specifically referring to the recommendation, I do think it will very much depend on what recommendations the government accepts and whether they accept them as a whole or take bits and pieces of it. But if that is taken by itself, then that might generate an issue if everything is just personal advice. But I think we talked about this, and there is a space for general advice, definitely.
Yes, yes. Although if the Levy, I suppose that's the next thing we have to talk about, is if the Levy recommendations get up. But assuming that one does, then that would render that advice personal advice, wouldn't it? Yeah. So
I think in the final report, there was a little bit of a change there regarding personal and general advice, because I think the initial report recommended no more general advice at all. And there is still a place for it in the current report, and I think that was intended more to cover activities like, you know, webinars or
Yes.
seminars, or, you know, where you might be providing information to a group rather
Mm.
than an individual. But certainly, you know, in order to use that provision, you need to not charge for the advice. So in the case of a super fund, it would be collectively charged, and B, you have to use the information that you have on the member, or they have an entitlement to consider that you would be using that information when you're providing that advice to them. So, you know, I think that's, you know, for many funds, that's uncontroversial. The funds that might find that challenging are funds that have a number of legacy systems that might have information about that member split across multiple systems, that is going to be technically challenging, I think. But certainly the proposal would assume that, no, irrespective of where that information lives, you need to take it into account. Does that make sense?
Yep. When I set this topic at the beginning of the year, I actually thought, you know, this week was following budget night on Tuesday, and I thought we might get some information about what would happen with the Levy report. And of course, we've seen the extraordinary situation where Michelle Levy has penned an open letter to the Financial Review and exhorting Minister Jones to actually do something. And we've got cricket. So what do we think is going to happen?
Well, I mean, the minister's been pretty consistent in that he said that he was unable to provide any more information before the budget. Well, the budget was Tuesday. He was recently, I think, on a webinar or a podcast where he's clarified that we can expect to hear something late May or early June. So I think that intent and commitment is there. I think there is a recognition that the issues that the report is addressing are important and need to be dealt with. I think what's being worked through is how will we go about that? You know, what's our position on the recommendations, but then insofar as we agree with them, how are we going to roll them out? Because there are changes to the law involved. So as I understand it, the focus now is on kind of parceling them up into what sort of staged approach will be taken on the report.
Okay. And best case scenario for you?
Look, certainly for us, and we work with a number of other associations as well, called the Joint Associations Working Group, and this is a common position. We believe there are a number of quick wins that will help very rapidly to reduce the cost of advice, remove a lot of the red tape, a lot of the provisions that don't help consumers but are contributing to the high cost of advice. So, you know, our suggestion would be that that's a package of, you know, red tape that probably many of the people on this call wouldn't be aware of. Reports like the fee disclosure reports, red tape like multiple versions of advice consents, some of the DDO reporting obligations that planners have, requirements in terms of disclosure of FSGs. The one that people may be more aware of is a proposal that advice, the form of advice or the statement of advice might not live in the Corps Act anymore, that there might be a recognition that it is with the profession to determine what is the form of the advice that the consumer needs to see. But broadly speaking, those are, you know, I'm not sure if quick fixes is the word, but there's certainly a group of proposals that we think could be executed fairly quickly, and we'd love them to be. And then there are some proposals that are more complex. A lot of the proposals we've spoken about today around what can a product issuer or a super trustee do? Could they give this good advice to personal clients under what circumstances? That's generated a lot more debate, a lot more uncertainty, and there's a sense that we might need a bit more time to finesse that one.
What about the inquiry into the inquiry? Is that going to happen? What do you think?
That does, yeah, there's a lot happening, isn't there,
Yeah,
like that?
yeah.
And if it does happen, I suspect we'll get a very short period to consult.
Yes, okay. But I think given the scale of the changes, presumably we would be pushing for a very much longer period of consultation. Would that be right? And I mean, what would impact a super fund if, Amy, do you think if some of these low hanging fruit recommendations were adopted? Do you think? You thought about it?
Look, I just think we've got a change of government, so I would just wait and see. If it is my position anyway. And unless some of those recommendations are taken together, they may or may not benefit a super fund. So for example, when we talk about the definitions of advice, good advice, and then the change in disclosure, if you take one but not all, it has different impacts.
Yeah. Any final comments from you two? Yeah.
That we need to think about execution. If I'm a digital advisor, I can't do it piecemeal. I need to know my framework. And that might mean that, in my mind, it'd be nice to see some of these happen holistically, however hard it is. But having said that, there are one or two very quick wins that would make no difference to my mind. And we've heard some of those from Sarah.
Any questions from the room? Yes.
When MySuper was first launched, the explanatory memorandum to the first tranche implied that there'd be a My Retirement default that would come up. And given Tim's comments in terms of soft defaults and potentially hard defaults, in terms of the panelists' views, would a government-led default in retirement, does that create more challenges or does it create more opportunities for this sector?
Look, I think we've touched on a lot of the difficulties of applying the concept of a default at retirement. With an accumulation fund, getting it wrong is not going to blow somebody up. You get that transition to retirement wrong, you have the potential to blow somebody up. And I think the challenge is around how would the default be applied? How would we ensure that the best interests of that individual member were being delivered on via that default? And, as Amy mentioned right now, that's a new product, for example. So the Corporations Act would say, no, you can't default someone into that product. So there would be a number of changes that would be required. And certainly, from the perspective of an organisation that supports financial advice, the things that our members see every day are all the ways that people are different. There are ways that they're similar, but when it comes to transition to retirement, the right default for someone who's up to their third ex-wife, who's got a complex intergenerational situation, that's a default for them might look very different to a default for someone who's unpartnered. I could go on, but I think, over time, we will need to get tighter about how that transition works. But I think it's hard to see a world anytime soon where there's not some element of, would that default work for that person without risking the outcomes for consumers? And that's why we're all here at the end of the day. We want Australians to be better off. We want them to maximise their wealth. We want them to maximise their retirement. And yeah, we've created a system where that's very hard to do with simple defaults.
And I should distinguish, when Tim and I talk about defaults at the moment, we're talking about defaults within the current framework. We're not necessarily suggesting that the system should default to members to a pension product. So we're just talking about how do you do forms, how do you change behaviour so that there's less decision-making by a member so that they don't have to think about and fill in a form or do things within the legal framework. But it is a great question.
I'll just add, initially, we also heard about something called CIPPers, the Comprehensive Income Products for Retirement. And when people got under the skin, that proved far too hard. And that's why it was simplified at the end.
And there's also ethical dilemmas too, as Sarah's talked about. But, if you do have someone who, a couple with such an age difference and one's about to retire and you default that person into a retirement pension, but they can actually do a co-contribution strategy to their spouse and then maximise their pension, that's an ethical dilemma if that person gets defaulted and then they don't have enough in retirement.
I don't know that we've solved any problems. But anyway, I think we have to have this conversation much more vociferously, actually. I just think it's sort of, we've got this big pot of money and now we've got to work out the best way of spending it, not wastefully. Anyway, on that grim note, I'm going to, unless anyone else has any more questions, I'm going to say that's the end of our presentation today, and I want to thank our guests for their, illuminating and very thoughtful answers. I actually think it was a great session. This is also the last session in our week. We've had a huge week under the banner of Spotlight on Financial Services. We were keen to showcase the diversity of our financial services practice, and we did that by hosting 10 events over 5 days. And after this is over, we're all going to go home and have a little lie down, I think, so, but anyway, it's been terrific. And I look forward to welcoming you and our online visitors back to Hall and Wilcox next time. Thank you very much.